Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And boy, there has never been a time I am more grateful to have as a friend, our founding friend, David French, columnist in the New York Times, to help us make sense of this crazy world, or at least crazy it seems to me, the first few weeks of the Trump administration. David, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me back, Curtis. We're just saying in the green room, and like God in his providence allowed me to teach a course this semester about the foundational structures of the American government and the reasons for it, why we did it. And rarely has an undergrad college course been more relevant than what we're dealing with right now.
Well, just to date this is February 3rd on a Monday. Who knows what is going to happen between now and when this drops later this week. But let me start by just asking sort of a very basic question. David, how bad is it? How bad is it?
So the answer is it's very bad. We don't know how bad exactly yet, though, because one thing I want to be very cautious about is, and we use this term, it's a term developed in wartime. We're obviously not in war, but fog of war.
Yeah.
It's very helpful to just articulate and name fog of war before we start anything, because there are a lot of things we don't know. I mean, we can obviously read executive orders. We're getting some reporting about sort of the role of Elon Musk's Doge and how he might be bringing people into government without security clearances who are having access to sensitive information. We don't know exactly what Doge is yet, for example. There's just a lot we don't know. And I would say there's a lot that even the Trump administration doesn't know, because there's a read and react decision, kind of process going on with them as well. So, there are a number of different ways you can kind of take the conversation. But here's how I would put it, Curtis, and this is something I'm going to be writing. For a long time, the critique of MAGA was that it had an approach that was the ends justify the means. So this is a very common approach made against, say, the hard left, that, someone's trying to say, explain the difference in the far left and the far right. And I said, well, the far left will want you dead if you don't agree with them on universal health care. And the far right might want you dead if you don't agree with them on, drag queen story hour. I don't know. I mean, but they have very different aims.
Yeah. Maybe
want you dead is extreme, although there are some people like that, but want to destroy you, want to annihilate you, right? And so there might be very different policy outcomes, but the big critique of the far right and the far left has always been they'll do, by any means necessary, they'll do what they need to do. That is true. I think that is still true for MAGA. But there's another thing, Curtis, is going on. The ends are becoming the means, because what we're dealing with is not just a series of policy choices that are being advanced in unorthodox ways or through extremely pugilistic public rhetoric. What we're dealing with is a fundamental attack on the foundational structure of the government, including the envisioned role of the legislature, the envisioned role of the president, and perhaps even the envisioned role of the judiciary. Okay. So that if it is successful, 100 years from now, we'll talk about aid to Ukraine being cut off or not, or whatever. But 90% of the things that we are talking about, like the actual policy issues that we're talking about, there will be a footnote to history. What will be written about is a change in character of American governance that could have a century's worth of consequences if it's not arrested, if it is not restrained. And so that is what we're talking about, is not only have we gone from a world in which the ends justify the means, say, but we're in a world where the means are the ends, and the changing of the structure of their government becomes sort of the end in itself.
Well, how much of that change of the very ends is really to achieve authoritarian rule, to achieve essentially where one person holds all of the power in direct opposition to what our founders, what the Constitution, what all of our tradition is meant to actually guard against, is essentially a one-person rule that acts as a god over the political world. Like, is that essentially what we're talking about here?
Yes, and to the short answer to that is yes. So, if you want to rewind the clock back to the American founding, one of the principal purposes of the 1787 Constitution was to destroy the possibility of a monarchy or anything that looked like a monarchy. So if you want to go back and you want to look at what was the situation that colonists were dealing with, the colonists were dealing with an evolving monarchy in England, but where historically, now there are parliamentary checks that did not exist, 100, 200 years ago. You had an English Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution and things like this. But the big concern was really consolidated power. And particularly when they looked at consolidated power, their main example was British history. And the British kings, remember, had an enormous amount of power, slowly, gradually clawed back a little, Magna Carta and then the English Civil Wars. And then so there's this fight between the Parliament and Crown that had been going on for a long time. But the concentrated power of the Crown was of supreme concern. And what did that concentrated power look like? So in the Crown, you had the nation's chief warrior, you had the nation's chief politician, you had the nation's chief judge, and you also had the nation's high priest. That was all theoretically under the umbrella of the Crown. And so if you're going to go back and you're going to look at all of those prongs of power, what did we do? What we did in the 1787 Constitution and the Bill of Rights following it, we took the high priest function and we kicked it out of government entirely so that government has no ecclesiastical authority at all, okay? We took the warrior function and we split it between the legislature and the president. Legislature declares war, legislature raises money for the military, and then the president commands the forces in the field. We took the politician function and we split it between the legislature and the president, where the legislature passes the laws, the president enforces the laws. We took the judging function. We gave it primarily to the judiciary, but with both presidential and legislative checks, with the president nominating and the Senate confirming. So again and again, what we did is you took every single traditional function of an absolute monarch and split it up into different branches of government. And so but that was not an inevitability that we would do that. There was some talk that if Washington wanted to, he could have become not necessarily maybe a king, but, have achieved near monarchical powers. And in fact, maybe if he had really tried in his first two terms to stretch his authority, he had such reverence, within the United States body politic that he probably had more room to run than any president in American history. And he chose not to, right? He set that precedent. And so what we're dealing with right now is essentially an unraveling of that constitutional structure, followed by consolidation of power in the hands of the president. And a lot of our super wonky and nerdy listeners, God bless you, I'm one of you, are sitting here right now saying, David, this has been going on for generations. Yes, it has. Yes, it has. However, we're at a point where, was it Hemingway who said, how does a man go bankrupt? Slowly, but then suddenly?
Suddenly, yeah.
That's where we are. That's where we are. A lot of slow unraveling. What's that old phrase? It's the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah.
If a straw is going to break a camel's back, that back's pretty weak. This is more like the 2x4 that breaks the camel's back. But even a 2x, it's the camel's back is still weakened to be vulnerable to the 2x4. And so we have had a long accumulation of power in the hands of the executive, mainly because the legislative has abdicated its role. But now the president has basically said, that's not enough. That's not enough. I want it all. And that's where, that's where we're moving, is in that. Now, obviously, he's not dissolving Congress. He's not, he's not gone to the point of actually sort of declaring himself some sort of Putin-esque leader, but he's making a series of decisions and enacting a series of measures that are a more dramatic attack on the legislative prerogative than we've seen in my lifetime. And it remains to be seen whether that will be followed up with a dramatic attack on judicial authority. That we don't know.
And what's your assessment of that? Because it seems like this is like our best hope of restraining this runaway authoritarian train.
Without question.
Judicial.
Yeah.
So what's your assessment of how likely that is going to serve as an effective break on this reach for power, for absolute power?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm going to give you an answer that is a little bit disconcerting, Curtis, because the judicial branch does have some ability, it has the ability to hold people in contempt, for example. But at the end of the day, somebody, if at the end of the day, even a contempt order, there's got to be like somebody with a gun that enforces a contempt order, right? Yeah. So, the problem that we have is that obviously the judicial branch does not have the full ability to enforce its orders. It has legal authority to issue an order. It does not have a practical ability to enforce its orders. And so the question would become, if a President Trump just decided, let's say the Supreme Court decides 9-0 on birthright citizenship, does he say, well, so what? So what? And then what happens? And this is where it gets really nerve-wracking, Curtis, because then it goes to Mike Johnson and the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. The final backstop is impeachment and removal. That is the final backstop. And I feel like with the failure of impeachment and removal after January 6th, Trump kind of pre-destroyed the backstop.
Right.
If that's not going to do it,
Yeah, exactly.
What's going to do it?
Defying another legal order isn't going to do it. So David, this is a really bleak picture that you're painting. What are we to do here? What is the course of action that seems that we should be praying for, working for, hoping for?
Boy, so, some of this is really hard, Curtis, because the simple fact of the matter is this is not 2017 anymore.
Yeah.
In 2017, there was this sense that Trump was an aberration. He sort of drew an inside straight, and he won, 3 key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, by the skin of his teeth. He lost the popular vote by a pretty decent margin. This was the accidental presidency. The resistance rose up. There was, 1 million people in the streets in the first weeks of his presidency. And this real sense that this is an aberration in a weird way, in what in hindsight looks to be like one of the more destructive ideas in modern American history. A lot of people on the far left started to feel like Trump would so thoroughly discredit the right that this was their moment to really push a much more radicalized agenda for the Democratic Party. They saw Trump as opportunity, not threat. They thought that he would be so bad, flame out so badly, that they could really accomplish a lot of wish list things. They yanked the Democratic Party to the left in a way that arguably cost them the 2024 election. And so here we have, it's not 2017, it's 2025. And in 2025, the Democratic Party is very demoralized. There is no sense of a budding mass movement, a lot sort of to be in the streets. There's also a sense that maybe that would be counterproductive, that he would use large scale protests as a pretext to implement the Insurrection Act and put troops in the streets. So there's a sense that, are there dangers with a mass movement of street protest? So what you're left with are two answers that for a lot of people are really unsatisfactory. One is you got to go to court and you got to put all this stuff to the test. You got to get those court orders and throw the ball right back into Trump's court and say, what are you going to do now? And then the other thing is, I'm sorry, but there has to be a process of the rehabilitation and re-energizing of the Democratic Party. But Because right now, the Republican Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of MAGA Incorporated. Yeah. The idea that as of right now, if you made me bet, I would bet that Kash Patel is going to be nominated. I mean, confirmed. And I hope I'm wrong. I will be the happiest person in the world to be wrong. I will dunk on myself happily if I'm wrong about that. But the idea that a Kash Patel could be confirmed as an FBI director that nothing, not even impeachment, tells me how neutered the Republicans are by Donald Trump. If you are looking for integrity in the modern Republican Party, and if people are willing to risk maybe even their political careers to withstand even the most gross abuses of power, I'm not saying nobody in the Senate will do it, but as a general matter, you have come to the wrong party at the wrong time. So we're left with, at this moment, nothing more than the rehabilitation of the Democratic Party, but that's for 2026. Yeah. If you're talking about what to do between 2025 and January of 2027, when theoretically a new Congress could be sworn in, you really are looking at the courts. That is what you're looking at.
So it seems like let's put this in the context of from a Christian perspective, because this kind of analysis that we're doing is really important for everyone, including Christians, to grasp. But they're going to get that elsewhere in other news sources and in your New York Times and so forth. What we're here to do is to try to help followers of Jesus make sense of this moment. So we seem to be arriving at this moment that where we as Christians are at a pivotal state in our society where for the common good is hanging a little bit by a thread here. So what does it mean to be a Christian in this particular moment? What are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to pray? How are we supposed to be even internally in ourselves?
So we're dealing with a double challenge here in some ways. So challenge number one, and they're both familiar to Christians in history. So challenge number one is, what is it like to live as a Christian in an increasingly authoritarian society, which would be the norm for most Christians across human history? So a lot of what you're going to, there's a lot of guidance for that. There's sort of here's some guidance for what it's like to live as a Christian in an authoritarian society. It's called the New Testament. Curtis, the whole thing is written to a beleaguered church in an authoritarian world, right? Yeah. Where they have the most limited rights or non-existent at all. And so, I think that there's in an interesting way, we have the tools for that. Mm-hmm. Here's what's harder. What if most of the church is the reason for the authoritarian move in the society? Yeah. Let's just be honest. Right now, if you look at exit poll data, I'm going to share some information with you that might be a surprise to some of our listeners. This is how the election broke down, if you want to know the raw numbers. White evangelical born-again Christians voted for Trump 82% to 17%.
Ouch.
Everyone else in America rejected Trump 58% to 40%. I want everyone to sit with that for a minute. The American white evangelical church voted from 82 to 17. That's 23% of the vote. That was people who told pollsters, I'm a white born-again evangelical. The other 77% of America voted against Trump, not narrowly, by a landslide amount of 58 to 40. Donald Trump is American Christianity's president. Well, let me put it this way. Donald Trump is the white evangelical church's gift to America. Now, it is true that if maybe it had been 60-40 instead of 58-40 or 62-38 with everyone else instead of 58-40, maybe Trump would have lost. So an even bigger supermajority of non-white evangelical people who are not white evangelicals would have overcome that supermajority. But this is what is very challenging, I know, for me as a believer in Jesus. This chaos, this injustice, this cruelty does not occur but for the overwhelming support of the white evangelical church in the United States. To me, that is a harder thing to deal with than an authoritarian country. Because if you have an authoritarian country and you have, I don't mean harder thing to deal with in the sense of like raw physical danger, right? I'm talking about as a spiritual concept, because the idea, I think it is easier for people to say and grasp and understand and process that I am suffering because of the sin of the world. It is a harder thing for people to grasp and deal with, especially believing Christians, say, I am suffering and injustice is metastasizing because of the sins of the church. That's I don't know about you, Curtis. I don't know. You might have a different, I think we're all different on this, but you might have a different approach to this. But my view is that is a harder thing for me to take in.
Yeah. Well, it's the difference between saying the primary act here is protest or obedience or submission, whatever, like some action to an external entity, versus the primary act here is repentance, is challenging of heresy, challenging of an internal error in the church, which is what you're really pointing to, is actually, if this is going to change, it has to start with us. It has to start with the church recognizing the error of its ways.
And look, Curtis, when I say it was 82-17, I want to say this again. Very good people whom I love voted for Donald Trump. I respect them. They voted for Donald Trump. Also, I know Democratic Party's not exactly God's party. Right. A lot of problems. There are a lot of good reasons why Christians would not want to vote for a Democrat. And there are a lot of reasons why I think a lot of good people would say, right in this moment, this is not what I voted for. This is not what I wanted. And I can respect that completely. But what we're seeing right now is Trump is absolutely blowing through guardrails at a level that if I had tried to say he would do this beforehand, people would say, you're clutching your pearls, you're getting hysterical, you're ridiculous, you've got Trump derangement syndrome. But he's blowing through all of that, and I'm detecting zero remorse, regret from, even some of the really good folks that I know, right? And also I'm seeing a lot of glee from the core, like Trumpist quarters of Christianity. And so I think here's the reason, Curtis, why I think this is particularly hard in this moment for many Christians. Because I think we're told and understand that this world is not our home, that as much as we might love our country, we are not fundamentally defined by our patriotism. We are fundamentally defined by our obedience to Jesus Christ. And so the idea of a Christian sort of feeling alienated from his or her country is not a new thing, nor is it always a bad thing. I mean, we should have always maintained a bit of separation, not in the sense that I serve my country in uniform, but my primary identity has never been as an American more than a Christian. But I do think that when you have moments like this that happens, what happens is lots of people not only feel like they're feeling their country slip away, they also feel like their church home and their church community is slipping away. And I can tell you, of the two, the loss of that feeling of a church community is harder for me to handle than the sense of a loss of, a sense of loss in connection with national politics or even national policy. Like, I'm used to that. I've been through Curtis, it's been more than 20 years now since I was happy about an election outcome. So like a presidential election outcome. So, fully happy about it. And so I'm used to losing elections and having policies that I don't like. And that's just life in a democracy. But this idea that so many people in the church are going to marry themselves so much to this viciously authoritarian and cruel man, and then judge your faith and judge your membership in the community by your allegiance to that man, I think a lot of people, this is where a lot of people are feeling it to the marrow of their bones.
We're talking about this moment as Christians where we have to not just confront that we are facing the rise of authoritarianism in our very country that seems right now facing very few checks, but also, as David has pointed out very pointedly, that Christians are actually complicit in this in a very profound way. David, that figure of roughly 80 to 80% voted for Trump. It's disconcerting, but you could flip it and say and pull a God speaking to Elijah moment on the mountain that, like, hey, there's 20% that have not bent the knee. Sometimes we underestimate the importance of a courageous, mobilized, and articulate minority. And that's the thing we sort of need right now. We clearly can't move the meters on the large block of voters at this moment. But if we're part of the minority that recognizes that there is something deeply wrong here, we need to at least find our own voices. So, David, it seems like almost like remedial, but I think we actually need it. Like, what is the basic case that we make and say, we as Christians do not, even you can agree with different on specific policies, but we do not want authoritarianism. And what we're seeing right now is a reckless path towards a grab for authoritarian power. Like, make the case, help, let's say, our listener out there who is the neighbor or the cousin or the son of somebody who voted for Trump. They are somebody who actually still has a relationship with somebody that is in the Republican base that could actually make a difference in how Republicans respond to this. What would be the lines you'd want to equip somebody to make this case to say, this, we can disagree on specific policies, but this is not what a Christian wants?
Well, I do think that there are ways through, potentially. The problem is they're actually narrowing significantly. So in 2017, 2018, 2019, I took an approach that was, because I was never Trump, but when he was president, if he did something I liked, I'm going to say that I like it. If I did something he didn't like, I would say that I didn't like it. So, for example, the strike on Qasem Soleimani, I believed was the right thing to do. Maybe a lot of listeners will disagree with me on this, but I liked the tax cuts early. I thought our corporate tax rate in particular was too high. I thought it was too much of a tax cut. More should have gone to families, less to corporations, but that's a quibble. So there were things that I liked, and there were things that I didn't like. And I would say through 2019, moving into 2020, that was actually a culturally viable position within the church. Now, I had some tough moments, no question. I had tough conversations and tough moments, but I did not feel, and many others I know sort of that were in the same boat as me, did not feel fundamentally rejected. But as this moment went on, and support for Trump became not so much I'm supporting this politician as a normal politician, and therefore am open to disagreeing with some of his policies and approving of some of his policies. We began to see this morphing, and it really became a very real thing in 2020, where supporting for Trump was more an identity marker, and that the policies were much less important than the standing with Trump. This is the phenomenon where, you had people going from I'm voting for Trump and holding my nose to, by October 2020, they're the third mastercraft in the boat parade, right? And then you really saw the strength of that after January 6th, where McConnell and Mike Pence's approval rating with Republicans plummeted because they did their constitutional duty. And Trump's approval rating with Republicans stayed very, very high. And immediately that should have sent a message. This is not about policies anymore. This is about a person and an identity marker. And so I have then since found it even more difficult to separate a policy out. And because one of the quick questions is internal check. Where does this leave me with MAGA and with Trump? And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why you're seeing it very hard for senators to vote against even a Kash Patel. Now, hopefully 4 will. It just takes 4 Republicans, but hopefully 4 of them will. But think about how sad it is, Curtis. If 4 out of 53 vote against Kash Patel, we'll view that as a victory when he should not get a single vote in the Senate. And so what has ended up happening is that the issues have become merged with identity. Identity as a Trump supporter is sort of merging with identity as a Christian, identity as a Republican. It's becoming an uber identity marker. And so therefore, anytime you're taking on identity, it's 100 times harder, just 100 times harder. And so it's almost like you have to try to unwind that before you can even get into issues. And I don't think there's a great way to do it. If I had a magic bullet for doing this, but I do think it's very important to understand the reality, because you will walk into a conversation. Let's suppose it's the TikTok ban. Let's just take something that's not a super emotional culture war issue. Let's say it's the TikTok ban. You're a hawk on China. Your MAGA friend is a hawk on China. You think we can get some common ground. I can get him to disagree with Trump here. The instant they realize they're going to disagree with Trump, you'll see the backpedaling. And then you'll not just see the backpedaling, you'll see the hostility emerge to you. Because what are you trying to do? Are you trying to pry me away? It's almost seen as an identity attack.
Yeah.
And so I think that understanding that dynamic helps us understand the extreme response that you sometimes get, even when you think you're just talking about a legal issue, and it'll trigger a much more extreme response. So my thought about it is, and again, if I had figured this out, I'd have been shouting it from the mountaintops, but this is just my best guess is you have to figure out a way to reorder trust in the relationship. Because the thing I think that is shocking is that I have found that people will trust on politics, a Trumpist or a MAGA public figure, more than people they know and love, even people they know and love who might be, say, experts in the field or have done this forever or are far more informed than the MAGA voice. So a lot of it is reordering trust. And that means maintaining relationship. That means building from whatever shards of commonality you have left. It means it's very, very difficult. But again, because you're at that identity marker level, because anything that hits identity marker level is removed in many ways from sort of, let us reason together.
Right. We have some remaining shards of hope. Perhaps some Republicans will find their backbone. We're hoping the courts can somehow be a last stop against this. But let's just play this out a little, David. Let's say, the Republicans continue, as we predict, probably they will, to cave to Trump. Let's say that Trump even is so emboldened as to just blow through the courts and their limited ability to enforce whatever decisions they make. At that point, then, okay, we're living in an authoritarian regime. It's shocking that, we've gotten here kind of as fast as we did. But like you've said before, there were a lot of warning signs that we were moving in this direction already. But we are here now. What spiritually does it mean for, let's say, for a dissenting Christian in an authoritarian regime? Like, yes, we have some moves to make in terms of we can still try to not bend the knee ourselves. We can try to reach out to the relationships we do have to try to, persuade them otherwise. But what is the posture that we need to start building in ourselves? Because it seems like there's some new muscles we're going to need.
Yeah.
It's not that we don't have a playbook, but we're not built for this after hundreds of years as Christians.
Well, can I go back to our after party?
Yeah.
I think we need to hear from, and we need to think this through with people from this era of the civil rights movement, because, and even before the civil rights movement, you know, and because I want to be very careful here. Okay. I'm super careful here. Nothing that Trump is doing is as bad as Jim Crow. Okay. Nothing he's doing is as bad as Jim Crow. So I'm just going to put that out there. But what I'm going to say is that we had a vibrant Christian faith amongst Black Americans in the South during Jim Crow, during a worse situation than now.
That's
okay.
Right.
During a worse situation than now. We had followers of Jesus who were loving Jesus and raising families in a worse situation than we are now.
Yeah.
And
they were getting lynched. They were actually denied very basic rights. They were intimidated from the vote. Yeah.
10 times worse. 10 times worse. I mean, 10 times worse is probably an understatement. But so I want everybody to understand that. Now, someone will clip all of that caveat and put on Twitter everything I'm about to say next, and then say, David French is saying Donald Trump is Bull Connor. But no. So we have in this country living memory of vibrant Christianity in authoritarian circumstances, of Christian community in authoritarian circumstances, of Christian joy in authoritarian circumstances, even as oppression hurt. Okay. So we have that living, you know, that is a memory within the American system. And I think it would be really interesting to hear from Christians, you know, historians of American Christianity and of Black American Christianity in the period. People have memory because it's not been that long. 64 is not that long ago. And 64 with the Civil Rights Act didn't end oppression. It really was more like the beginning of the end of the legalized, you know, systems of oppression. So I do think, you know, look, we have a history of American Christianity persevering in the face of worse than this.
Yeah. And for much longer.
So I do think that, you know, and I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but I was at an event with two of my very, very good friends, John Anazu, who you know, Curtis, and Ibu Patel. And we're at a gathering of folks, and we're talking about most of these sort of evangelical gatherings, like I call them the Save the World's gatherings, you know, where a bunch of concerned people get together and they decide, we're trying to figure out how can we rescue everything. I've been to like 100 of those meetings, you know, the Save the World meetings, and they're good. I'm not making fun of them. I participate happily. They're necessary. Like, we should be trying hard to figure out how to reverse this. But the meeting I went to with John and Ibu was interesting. It's a little bit different because it was how to live faithfully, essentially, when we are not in power, when we don't have the prospect of being in power. How do we live faithfully if in the absence of sort of this hope of imminent political reform and reversal, you know? So, and that is a different question than sort of the save the world kind of question of how do we get back in control is the save the world, or how do our allies or how do the forces of good and get back in control is a different question than how do the forces of good and followers of Jesus live in a circumstance where we don't have power, we don't have authority, and there isn't any immediate prospects of having power or authority.
Well, how is this working out for you, David? Because you see the reality, you see the stark possibilities of where this could go. For you, how, like, let's just start with some basic things that I think the civil rights movement teaches you need, right? Like, you need community. You need a community that such that you are not alone in suffering this. You need hope, some longer hope than what the immediate political calculus tells you. You need to have some course of action that you can take so that you're not just paralyzed. Like, what does this mean? Like, just be a role model for us. How do we even get started on this?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, that's a great question. So we're actually thinking through this pretty deliberately, Curtis. And I'm thinking of it in sort of a concentric circles sort of way. So the fundamental inner concentric circle is my family. What are we doing to sort of keep the family safe and intact in these circumstances? And you might think that's a weird thing to say, but it's not a weird thing to say at all. I mean, as we've detailed over the last several years, I mean, we faced a lot of threats and harassment, and with the release of a lot of violent criminals who are super devoted MAGA cultists. We are aware of our own vulnerability. And so one thing is, okay, but not just physical vulnerability, but sort of, the emotional vulnerability of relentless hatred and exclusion. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're really doubling down on our family and doing the necessary things to keep us together, so mutually supportive. And so that sounds very basic and very simple, but I think it's indispensable. You cannot become so focused on the things happening out here away from you that you start to lose the people who are closest to you.
Yeah.
And so I'm focusing, I'm having that concentric circle. And then the other thing is I have dear, dear friends who have not been caught up in all of this nonsense and who both help keep me grounded because they also are very free to speak into my life if maybe I'm too alarmist or maybe I said something wrong, so friends who are very solid and can speak into your life. And I think when you have that combination of the family solid with friends who love you, that gives you a base from which you can then extend yourself into the wider world in a much more effective and be healthy way.
Yeah.
And so I feel like by solidifying that sort of core of these relationships, it really does empower me to move into the much more difficult areas, because no matter what comes back at you online, or if the Kash Patel threats to go after his enemies list and their media allies materializes, and you start to maybe face something from the government, or then, I think this is pretty common to a lot of us. We can go through a lot if we're loved, and if we're in community. It is harder to go through anything if we're not.
Yeah.
And so I think that locating that community, doubling down on that community, but not isolating yourself within the community. Those are two different things. Locating the community and using the strength that you gain from your community and to move into the more rocky and dangerous waters, I think is really critical. But I also think that some folks, you just have to take a bit, have to take a minute. It's been 10 years of extreme political contentiousness. You don't have to be in every fight. You don't have to. You can press pause. We have to recognize we're only human, and there are voices everywhere saying you got to act now. Sometimes you have to rest for a minute. This is not going to be fixed by March.
I want to add one note to what you're saying about community, that especially as Christians gather in community in a moment when the world out there, the politics of the world seem very dark. The importance of that community gathering to worship is so crucial. I've been really trying to pay attention to that in my own worship life. We've been trying to organize, partly on the advice of Andy Crouch, who on a previous podcast sort of suggested, we'll just do home worship, just do like a house worship party. And we've been trying to do that. And it's been really interesting, David, that let me just say a caveat here. I'm not the guy who is always claiming and pointing to spiritual warfare when things go bad.
No.
You know me. I'm not that guy.
Yeah. You're not casting demons out of a parking spot so that you can get it. Yeah.
But we have tried to gather Christian friends for worship, the level of spiritual, just hard things, oppression, resistance to that has been so striking to me. And it's like, it's been actually easier to organize the after party. I'm speaking sort of, extremes, but in some ways, the after party, I felt like there was a wind behind my back in doing that. Gathering just a bunch of Christians to worship in our house in some ways emotionally felt like there was more resistance to that. And I sense that there's something to that because in a fundamental level, the most important thing Christians need to do in an authoritarian moment is to recognize who is actually king, who is the actual ruler, who actually holds history in his hands. And that's when we recognize that, especially when we express that in word and song, that's called worship. Yeah. And so worship is in that sense, a political act, not a partisan act, but it's a political act because you are saying, I actually am ascribing ultimate power, ultimate authority, ultimate responsibility, even for how this is all going to turn out, to God, who has revealed himself to actually be the ruler of the world in Jesus. And so it's important for us to nourish that worship activity. And I'm just admittingly struggling to construct that and to find that. But I think these next years is going to be crucially sustained. And the Black church in the civil rights movement, testifies to the importance of worship. That movement does not do what it does without a vibrant life of worship. Yeah.
Well, I do think it's interesting, Curtis, what you say, because I have had this sort of Old Testament feeling about the moment. Because, there's multiple occasions in the Old Testament where it will say that the people's hearts were hardened. Yeah. Or they had hard hearts. And I think that's where we are now. And we've been emphasizing a lot on sort of the MAGA side because the president is, the president. But we have seen an enormous amount of what you would just call hard-heartedness. The hard heart says, not only am I right, but I hold to the certainty of my righteousness. And then the hard heart also then moves away from virtue ethics into the friend-enemy distinction, this sort of Carl Schmitt thing that I wrote about a couple of weeks ago. And so what we have to realize is we're dealing with a lot of hard hearts. And so there's your prayer. Yeah. Soft hearts. Yeah. Not hard hearts, soft hearts. And so to me, that's the predicate. That is the soil, right? That you sow your ideas into and you sow, your thoughts into. And if the soil is just rocky, as the parable goes, even the most beautiful truth will find no purchase. Yeah. But if that's another
specifically Christian act that we have the playbook for is to praying for soft hearts, on all fronts. So David, thank you so much for taking the time to help us make sense of it. You're not alone. You're not crazy. And we will continue this conversation next week when we gather around the campfire.